Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I keep the grass even and the gates quiet at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. I like the hours before the city wakes, dew on the granite, gulls cutting between the Gothic spires, the way Fort Hamilton Parkway hums like distant surf. My name is Luis Ortega, head groundskeeper on the South Crew. On the morning the alerts began, I was staking a line along a family plot near Sylvan Path, tying orange twine to rebar so the backhoe wouldn't nip an old marble border. A breeze came up over valley water, cool and promising. It was a day for quiet work and a clean burial. At 8:17 a.m, my phone screamed with the same sound you get for flash floods in August. The notification banner said the words everyone remembers, the ones about a fast-moving illness, the shelter-in-place guidance, the warning to avoid close contact with anyone acting disoriented or unusually aggressive. My first thought was that I'd forward it to my crew, then go back to marking the corner points. But the second alert hit less than 2 minutes later, then a third, telling us to limit travel and expect delays in emergency response. Across the path, May, our horticulturist, a patient woman who could tell you the Latin name of a weed from 10 yards, lifted her head from a rosebush and looked at me. "You getting these too?" I held the screen up. "Same. We work with the living all day, but our customers are the ones who never speak." Greenwood turns into a city inside the city. Mourners, funeral directors, dog walkers who pretend they don't see the signs. On a normal morning, the main gate off 5th Avenue takes in a river of footsteps. That morning, it barely trickled. A hearse idled by the historic chapel, hazard lights ticking like a metronome. The director stepped out and made a phone call he repeated 3 times. Walking the loop between the chapel and the carriage path, he kept glancing at the road like he was expecting a convoy that never came. By 9, Samir, the night shift security guard, thin as a broom, kindness always peeking out from behind serious eyes, came rolling up in the electric cart with a clipboard on his lap. "Luis, management is advising we suspend all scheduled services until further notice. We're to close and secure once families depart." "Close the whole grounds?" I asked. "Temporarily," he said. "They say the city is, what's the word, stabilizing, just for a day." We both looked at the Gothic arch beyond the trees, the way it framed 5th Avenue, and beyond that, the slope to the harbour. The arch has watched wars and storms, and that week, every year when the parrots chatter in the eaves like they've paid rent, it didn't look like something that would allow itself to be closed. The burial that morning was for an elderly woman whose grandson had flown in 2 days earlier. 10 people had expected to attend. Only 4 reached us. They stood close in their coats, though the day was already warming, asking small questions they didn't want answered. I offered water and shade near the chapel and told them we would wait 15 minutes more, then continue whenever they were ready. The grandson nodded and tapped at his phone with the stubborn movements of someone trying to force a signal back into existence. When the service began, it was quiet, as she deserved. The minister kept his voice low. I helped the crew position the straps, checked the liner, kept my eyes on hands and faces, because I've learned the only thing worse than something going wrong is not noticing until it's too late. After the family stepped away, I stayed to make sure the vault closed clean, and the backhoe operator, Andre, a conservator who drove heavy machinery like a man arranging teacups, lowered the soil back exactly as it had been lifted. That was when the radio on my belt, the one we use for mundane things like "Where did you put the tamper?" and "Who took my line level?" crackled with something that didn't belong to us. It was a weatherband tone, followed by a female voice from City Emergency Management. The message was short, a recommendation to remain indoors, to minimize sound and light if you encountered individuals who appeared entranced or unresponsive, to avoid physical contact. It gave a number for updates and then repeated, Entranced, May said. What does that even mean? Before I could answer, a man wandered into the path from the slope of Battle Hill. I knew him by sight. A regular who walked at lunch, kept a notebook, liked to sit under the bronze of Minerva and look down toward the harbour where the statue across the water lifts her torch. He moved like he was drunk or trying not to step on chalk lines only he could see. His eyes were open too wide. When Samir called to him, "Sir, you okay?" he didn't look up. He seemed to be moving toward the sound of Samir's voice, but not seeing him. "Sir, please sit," I said, keeping my tone the way you speak to someone stepping onto a frozen pond, calm and strong. "We can get you help." There is a way people hesitate when they're deciding whether to listen. His body did not hesitate. His head turned as if our words were light scattering on glass. I saw his cheek twitch, like a muscle answering a question it didn't fully understand. I took 2 steps back and set my hand on the cool handle of the flat shovel I'd leaned against a granite bench. No thoughts about using it, just an old habit of wanting something between me and the part of the world I don't understand. He moved close enough that I could smell lemon from a laundromat and something else, the scent of heat when it meets old stone, and then he walked past us without a blink and kept going until his thigh brushed the low iron fence around the Gothic plot. He stopped there, fingers reaching for the iron, and stood looking at nothing. If you've ever watched a moth put itself between a lamp and everything else it could be doing, you understand. We called it in. The operator on 911 sounded like she'd been speaking without water for hours. She took our location, advised us to keep a safe distance, not to startle or touch him, not to make noise. "We have limited responsibility right now," she said. "If he's not actively harming anyone, please keep other people away from him and wait for further guidance." "Further guidance," Samir repeated when I ended the call. He changed the channel on his radio and reached the office. The landlines were still up there. The message from management, he said, was consistent with 911. "Close gates. Escort visitors out calmly. Don't use sirens or horns. Limit engine noise. Be mindful of lights. They think sound draws them," May said softly. "They didn't say that," I said. "They didn't have to. We gathered the 4 family members, explained we needed to finish our task quietly and slowly." They nodded. The grandson started to speak, then stopped and pressed his lips together. After we filled and raked the last soil, smoothed it with the back of the rake so it looked like a calm pond at dusk, we walked them out. On the way, we passed 2 more people moving the same way the Battle Hill walker had moved, like their bodies belonged to the ground and the ground had given them the wrong instructions. They weren't bleeding or snarling. Nothing from the movies. They were as frightening as clocks with missing hands. We closed the gates, not the big arch. That takes a day and a permit, but the smaller vehicle gate of Fort Hamilton Parkway. We parked a pair of maintenance pickups crosswise inside it and slipped heavy chains through each truck's frame and the iron posts. We draped canvas over the reflective striping and taped cardboard over the hazard beacons. Noise discipline, light discipline. The cemetery has outlasted cannonades and ice storms and the years when the city forgot how to love it. It knows how to be quiet. By noon, 5th Avenue had changed. It always hums, always a weave of delivery vans and buses with the hiss of brakes. And that day, it thinned until it was mostly sirens and a low, rolling churn from the Gowanus Expressway. Twice we heard the rotors of a helicopter pass, once close, once far. The office radio carried a brief announcement from the mayor, measured and deliberate. The guidance was the same. Stay indoors if you can. If you can't, move as a group and keep your voices down. If you must signal, do so with flashlights or with an emergency whistle, short bursts. We inventoried what we had. I sent Andre to the tool barn for radios and spare batteries. We kept a set of Motorola handhelds for events and winter storms. I checked the fuel room. Diesel for the mowers and the backhoe. A small supply of gasoline stabilized. 2 propane canisters for the space heater. The generator for the office wasn't large, but it could keep lights on if we needed them and the radio charging. In the fridge was bottled water intended for summer tours and a pan of brownies labelled "Docent Volunteer, Do Not Touch." I took out a roll of painter's tape and started covering any LED that caught my eye. Around 1, a cluster of visitors drifted to the ironwork at the Fifth Avenue edge. We'd left the pedestrian side closed, with a chain and a polite sign. They weren't angry, they were frightened in the way of people who had just walked past 4 different versions of concern in the span of a block. "Please," a woman said through the iron, "can we wait inside? My friends live over on 23rd, but they're not answering, and I don't want to be out here." "Inside is not safer by default," I said. "But if you move with us and keep your voices low and follow instructions, we can bring you to a secure building for the moment." We let them in at Fort Hamilton, in groups of 2, and led them along the ring road like we were taking a field trip through the biology of patience. We kept to the shaded side of things, avoided long sight lines, skirted the chapel where the stone throws voice in surprising ways. We brought them to the maintenance yard, a squat brick building that once served as a trolley house, its doors thick enough to argue with the wind. In the crew room, they sat on plastic chairs meant for damp uniforms and cups of coffee. I gave the briefest orientation of my life. Restrooms there, water here. If you need to cry, do. If you need to pray, do. Please keep your tone low, your steps steady. We will coordinate later for anyone who wants to move on. In a corner, a little boy fixated on a poster of a leaf with every vein labelled. He traced the ribs with his finger, like he'd never seen structure until that moment. From somewhere across the yard, a thump echoed, the kind of hollow sound that makes you think of old doors. I stepped outside with Samir and looked up at the south wall. A man had pressed his forehead against the iron, eyes closed. He wasn't shaking the gate. He wasn't even pushing. He had simply come to the loudest thing he could find and stopped there. "Lights?" Samir asked. I nodded. We kept the yard dark, left the interior lights capped or off. If we needed to work, we used headlamps and shaded them with our palms. When May moved between the barn and the crew room, she wrapped a scarf around the steel loops on her tool belt to stop them from chinking. Around 3, a radio call came from the office line. Management had spoken with the city and been advised that municipal shelters were being established as staffing allowed. The closest was likely to be a school gym on 4th Avenue, but traffic control was uncertain and the status could change by the minute. "We're to hold," Samir said, reading the email off the desktop with his finger. "We're to hold and maintain order and avoid drawing attention." "Any time frame?" I asked. "They say the next 24 hours will be critical." I walked the interior again. The grounds I knew had become a map of risks I had not trained for. Surfaces that reflected light too sharply, corners that could hold sound and give it back multiplied. A path along the ridge where a voice carries like it was made of helium and pride. At the catacombs, an underground vault built in the 19th century, often used for tours because everybody loves the comfort of cool stone in summer. Andre stood with a key in his hand, looking at the iron door like a person does when he needs something rare, and it happens to be exactly what he has. "It's quiet down there," he said, "and dry. One entrance, no windows. We could use it if the rooms get crowded." "We'll keep it in reserve," I said, though I marked it in my head with a bright circle. As sunset worked its way toward the horizon, Brooklyn's version of sunset, which is to say the color lift is something you catch in reflections more than the sky, we heard a scuffle at the Fifth Avenue side. 2 men in delivery uniforms were helping a woman in a long coat. She had a cut on her forehead, not serious, and a way of looking at each of us like she'd misplaced something. Behind them, 3 figures had stopped along the fence line of a different property and stood as if the afternoon had been poured into them and left to set. We moved like we were delivering a piano, steady, no wasted motion. We let the trio in, guided them with 2-word sentences. "This way." Low voices. "Almost there." Whatever you said it like you'd been practicing for months. We bedded the woman on a couch in the break room and offered her a cool cloth. Someone found her a granola bar, and she smiled at it the way a person smiles at a hand-drawn map. Every small thing you can do becomes a large thing if you do it completely. Night came with the gentleness New York allows when it remembers it's a harbour town. Power flickered, steadied, then went for good in the southern half of the grounds. The office stayed bright because of the generator, but we ran it for half an hour and then cut it to save fuel. The battery lanterns we had were the good kind, the ones we use when we're up on Battle Hill in November adjusting the holiday lights. We shaded them with contractor bags and clipped the bags with clothespins so we could open or close slits like shutters. When the little boy saw how the light changed shapes, he laughed softly. We all looked at him like he just reminded us of a rule we'd forgotten. We assigned watches, no heroics, just observation and quiet coordination. Samir and I took the first pass around the inside of the fence, moving from cedar to cedar, keeping our feet in the path so we wouldn't snap twigs. A few times, we saw someone on the other side of the iron, frozen in place. Twice an infected person approached the sound of traffic and stopped when it dwindled, integrating into the fence line like a misplaced statue. I thought of the war dead on Battle Hill, of the straight rows and the curved ones, of how the living learn to become orderly when the world has gone ragged, because it's either become orderly or become a noise no one can live inside. At the chapel, we hesitated. The stained glass glowed because the generator in the basement, in its stubborn old age, had decided to keep doing the job it was made for until someone told it otherwise. Andre slipped in and killed it, with the same courtesy he uses to quit a room mid-conversation. Silence replaced the purr, so clean it almost hummed. Close to midnight, a knock rapped at the service door to the yard. We froze, not because of fear in the ordinary sense, but because sound begets sound. I peered through the peephole and found two familiar faces. Officer Cabrera, from the 72nd Precinct, had the look of someone who has been on 12 hours too long and is measuring what she says, not because she's tired, but because people will live inside the shape of whatever words she gives them. With her was a paramedic I recognized from summer incidents, a calm man with the steady hands of someone who has adjusted a collar in the back of a moving vehicle at least 100 times. We eased them in. They spoke low, almost like we were outside a nursery. The picture they painted was not chaos, it was complication. Some people were collapsing, some were becoming entranced, some were becoming erratic in ways that did not track with anything they'd trained for. Sirens drew the entranced, so did floodlights. The best thing to do, they said, was to reduce our signal and wait for coordinated movement at first light. "We can't extract anyone along 5th right now," Officer Cabrera said. "But if you have people inside, it's safer here than in the open if you keep it quiet." "How long do we need to hold?" I asked. "Until shift change and coordinated routes are established," she said. "And we need your help with something in the meantime." She asked for a quiet place to stage a small group who had been caught between destinations when a bus stalled. We decided on the catacombs. I turned the key in that old lock and felt the turn like a breath. Inside, the air was cool and dry, stone and memory. We unrolled plastic benches that we kept for tours and spread blankets from a bin. I taped paper over the emergency exit lights so they only bled red through the edges. The paramedic led the first 3 in, 2 seniors and a teenage girl with a sprained ankle. The seniors had the tired dignity of people who have been told to switch gates twice in one afternoon without being told why. The girl composed herself and then asked only for water. We made a rhythm of it. In small groups, in the dark, we walked people to the catacombs and kept our sound inside our throats. When someone needed to cry, they did, and we simply stood nearby so they didn't have to cry alone. On my second trip back from the catacombs, I saw the first erratic. On the slope near Del Water, a man loomed out from behind an oak, moving fast and without the flinch you expect. He didn't run exactly. Running implies intention, but his body delivered itself forward in hard bursts. I stepped sideways and raised my hands. "Sir," I said, firm and clear. "We can help you. Please slow down." He moved toward my voice. I could hear his breath, not ragged but measured, the kind of breath a person uses when they've forgotten what the other parts of their body are for. I slid behind a granite obelisk and spoke again from that position, drawing him away from a group who had paused near a gravel path. "This way," I said. He shuddered toward the sound. I let him pass where I'd stood moments before. When he did, I shifted again, patterned like a lighthouse, so he would find me repeatedly and thus never find me at all. He stopped at the water's edge, looking down at a world that was too quiet to make sense of his need. After 10 heartbeats, he stayed there, frozen in that new purpose. I told no one the fear I carried back to the catacombs. People who have a job during a storm know that fear has its own acoustics, and if you let it sing too loudly, it invites a chorus. Instead, I told May to take her break and to drink a full bottle of water. I told the paramedic where the first aid cabinet was. I told the little boy, which was true, that in the morning I would show him a leaf bigger than his face. In the small hours, when New York breathes in and your soul breathes with it, I sat on the steps of the catacombs and counted minutes. Samir sat beside me, a radio between us, a thermos of coffee he'd warmed briefly with the generator. We listened to the city. We heard footfalls that were not ours. Once, something metallic clinked and then did not clink again. Twice, distant voices skimmed the tops of the cedars like birds that had forgotten to choose a direction. We said nothing for long stretches. Occasionally, one of us would stand and move a piece of canvas to better hide a reflective sign. In the middle of some moment that had no shape, a siren far off started and cut, like it had coughed mid-sentence. I thought about my mother in Sunset Park, in a rent-stabilized apartment where she refuses to replace a clock that knocks on the hour because it belonged to my father. I had told her to stay put, to lock the door, to turn down the television and let me come when the sun lifted off the Atlantic. She had said, "Mijo, I will pray for your people. I'll put water on the stove. I'll write a note in case somebody needs to know where we are." I pictured the note taped to the inside of her door because she believes you should always tell the person you're trying to help what you're about to do. Near 4, the weather shifted. A small rain came, a fine mist, the kind that never makes it into the forecast because it is the city simply changing its mind. It slicked the leaves and gave the granite a darker argument with the light. It hushed feet. It bought us time. Anyone on the other side of the iron would drift toward the new sound, drops and gutters, rather than what we were quietly doing. May whispered, "Thank you," and I did not ask who she was thanking. By 5, we had 23 people sheltered that we hadn't had at noon. Some slept. Some watched the door with the patience of cats. The boy who had traced the leaf ribs now traced the filigree on a brass memorial plaque with the same serious finger. Officer Cabrera checked her watch and said, "First light in 47 minutes. She stepped outside and radioed something brief but complete. I couldn't hear the reply, but the way she nodded told me it was both worse and better than she'd hoped. We made a plan, not a heroic plan. A grocery list plan. At dawn, we would split into 2 groups. Group 1, those who did not feel steady on their feet, or who had young children, or who simply wanted to wait, would remain in the catacombs with Samir and May and the paramedic. Group 2, those willing to move would follow Officer Cabrera and me along the ridge by Battle Hill to a service gate that cut toward 4th Avenue, where a temporary shelter was being set at the high school gym. Moving would be done in silence, with hand signals, with pairs keeping a palm on the shoulder in front of them, if their nerves required it. If we encountered entranced individuals, we would detour. If we encountered erratic motion, we would stop and wait rather than attempt to bypass. If anyone wanted at any point to turn back, they could. We gave out strips of reflective tape to those who would move, worn under coat lapels, hidden until we needed them. We checked shoelaces. We took a deep breath, the kind you share when you're about to act on a plan in which every part of you is required to behave like the adult in the room. Dawn in Brooklyn, in a crisis, looks like the city has been holding its breath and has finally decided it is allowed another. The clouds were low, the edges of the trees turned into charcoal sketches, and the stones took back their places in the story. We moved. Slow first, then slightly less slow when the path opened. We kept to the crest where the ground gives you small choices every 10 feet. Below us, figures dotted the outer fence, still, mostly, like punctuation that had not agreed to be read. Twice, we saw someone moving fast, and twice we stopped, waited, and let that motion find another sentence to conclude. On the crest of Battle Hill, Minerva looked past us toward the harbour and her far friend. For the first time since I'd started working here, I placed my hand on the cold bronze of her robe and felt in it something I could use. Gratitude, maybe, or simple stubbornness. I whispered to her as if I were telling someone in a hospital bed that I would be right back with water and that I would not forget which room she was in. Chaosu. The service gate near 34th Street is nothing romantic, just iron and chain and a lock that sticks in winter. I'd sprayed it with graphite the week before because small kindnesses to locks make the days easier. I eased the key in. It turned the way it was taught. We opened that gate the way you open a door in a home when someone is sleeping nearby. On the other side, 4th Avenue stretched like a thought you could almost complete. A block away, 2 school safety officers stood with arms out like crossing guards, headbands on, faces set in a shape I recognized. The decision to be calm as a form of leadership. We did not march, we did not run, we flowed. If a car needed to pass, we paused. If a siren started too near, we dipped into a stoop and allowed the noise to move through us like wind. At the gym, volunteers with clipboards and vests that read "Community" in big letters met us with eye contact and hand movements you could understand, even if you had forgotten every word you'd ever learned. Inside, 3 cots had been set, then 6, then more. The little boy found a poster with constellations and replaced leaves with stars without changing the respect in his finger. I left our moving group with Officer Cabrera and a woman whose hair was held with a pencil. She looked like a math teacher, though she never said. I promised I would return for Group 1. On the way back, I cut through a block with trees planted in neat grids and thought about all the lines I've painted, in chalk on soil, in string on rebar, so that holes would be dug in the right places and nothing that shouldn't be disturbed would be disturbed. We are always drawing lines we hope the world will respect. Sometimes the world respects them. Sometimes it hands you a new marker and waits to see what you will do. The trip back to the catacombs was easier because I knew what sounds the city was making and what sounds it was not. I paused at the gate before stepping in and listened. A soft harmony of breathing, no clatter, no franticness. Inside, May was organizing a station with water and bandages. Samir was checking battery levels on lanterns. The paramedic had written names on gaffer's tape and stuck the tape to people's sleeves so that if they needed to call to someone without speaking, they could tap the name and point. "We're a go," I said. Slow and steady. The route is clean. We moved again. If you've never watched 20 people negotiate a garden path with the professionalism of a backstage crew, you should. The world can be difficult. The world can also be competent. A woman who had slept none at all offered her elbow to a man who had slept too well and now had trouble waking fully. The teenage girl with the sprain took each step like a person memorizing choreography. I led and Samir brought up the rear. At one point, I heard a faint humming. I thought it was a generator or a car idling. It was not. It was a cluster of infected across the avenue, gathered near a digital billboard we couldn't see, humming to its cycling brightness. We moved past them like a shadow decides to be a shadow. At the gym, when we arrived, a volunteer with clipped hair and a badge that read "Martyr" smiled with her eyes and gestured us in. In the doorway, I paused, not to be dramatic, to notice. The cots occupied one corner. A table held water and granola, and a stack of paper cups. Someone had set a large piece of cardboard on an easel and written in thick marker, "Quiet zone, communicate with hands when possible." Under that, another sign, "If you must make sound, make it brief." The city had learned a new language in half a day, written it by hand, and people were already reading it. I checked in with Officer Cabrera. "We'll run one more quiet sweep for neighbors who might need the escort," I said. "Then I'm going back to secure the grounds, when we can establish a rotation." "Keep yourself," she said, in the way the old folks in my mother's building say it, which means a great deal more than the 2 words it contains. When I reached the cemetery again, the light had fully arrived. Morning brings back the shapes. The places that felt like corridors of uncertainty recast themselves as paths I knew. The arch watched Fifth Avenue. The parrots, brave as they come, chattered from their nest like they had slept through war and were ready to argue with a passerby about trash collection schedules. The entranced along the fence had thinned, like they had followed different noises to different doors. A city crew had set cones at the corner where the sightline was worst. Someone had chalked a note on the sidewalk. "Safe water at the gym. Open quietly. Neighbors welcome." In the maintenance yard, I unlocked the office and started the generator for a half hour to top off batteries. I checked the fuel supply and noted we would need more by nightfall. I wrote a list on a legal pad on the desk. Items to find, people to check on, corners to darken before dusk, and tore the sheet in half so Samir would have one copy when he returned. On a whim, I wrote a second list. Things I could do without leaving. Fix the sticky door at the catacombs. Move the leaf blowers where the soundproofing was better. Deploy the tarps at Battle Hill to collect rain if the taps went dry. May came in, hair damp from the mist. Eyes bright with the kind of tired you feel rather than wear. "They have a botanist at the gym," she said, delighted at the coincidence. "She says they might set a quiet garden zone for the kids who need to move their hands over things." "That sounds like us," I said. "It does," she said. A city that moves on noise had learned to move on quiet. A place that prefers to keep its eyes on big events had learned to look at the angle of a door and the dignity of a steady walk. The dead where I work had not noticed, or, if they had, they did not say. The living had found out that they could be the kind of neighbors they wished for in the dark. At the 24th hour, I stood at the crest of Battle Hill with a walkie at my hip and a thermos of coffee that had made the trip from the gym and back. The sun, shy as ever, snagged itself on the tops of the cedars and then decided to come all the way up. I looked toward the harbour. The statue out there lifted her torch. Minerva lifted her hand. 2 figures greeting each other across a sheet of water like people across a hallway who have learned that they can speak with their palms. I breathed. I counted. I planned the next hour and the next. I had survived the first day, not because I was brave, but because the job had taught me a few simple things. Keep the grounds. Keep the quiet. Keep people walking on the paths where the ground is firm. The world had asked me to do my job at a higher setting. I had done it. I would do it again until the city learned its new habits thoroughly enough to call them old ones. And then, when this ended or reshaped itself into something we could name and fold into our stories, I would go back to spring cleanups, to marking lines in orange twine, to arguing lovingly with marble. I would keep the gates quiet. I would keep the lights low unless someone needed to see. If you had asked me a week earlier what I feared most, I'd have said loud engines on damp mornings, ladders near old stone, ice that pretends to be dry leaves. That list had not changed. We'd been told to make small plans and keep them entirely. We had. With that, you can do almost anything. You can walk 20 strangers through a dark garden and bring them to a door that opens on a gym that calls itself a harbour. You can keep a city's heartbeat under a coat so it doesn't draw the wrong attention. You can move without saying a word and make the kind of sound that matters only later, on a day when the power is back and the children draw leaves and stars with the same patient finger. By the time Samir returned with the last neighbour who had asked for accompaniment, the list on my desk had gained new check marks and new tasks. The catacombs were quiet, the generator was off, the lanterns were charged, the parrots bickered, the city breathed. It is not the style of this place to have a clear ending. We work within cycles, plantings, leaf drop, snow, thaw. If this had a name, It was a season. We had learned how to stand inside it without breaking anything that didn't need breaking. We would learn to turn the lights up again, slowly, like eyelids at morning. Until then, we would live inside the quiet we had made, and we would keep one eye on the path and one eye on the door, and our hands open to steady whoever needed the steadiness most. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.